the year 1780, the American Revolutionary War was being fought on two fronts, in the North and in the South. British General Sir Henry Clinton had succeeded in dividing the colonies by conquering Georgia and South Carolina. Two main cities, Savannah, Georgia, and Charlestown, South Carolina, were now under British control. In general, the Southern colonists were much more loyal to the British Crown than those in the Northern colonies. They were less likely to rebel against the British troops. This left the British free to conduct operations against the Americans, such as cutting off supplies to the colonists in the South. Lord Charles Cornwallis was appointed commander of the British armies in the South. He was known to have been shrewd and aggressive. His men were disciplined, well-trained, and well-equipped. Cornwallis commanded cavalry, infantry, and artillery, as well as Irish and Scottish volunteers. He had the utmost confidence in his men, and they followed his orders to the letter. The American forces, on the other hand, had been scattered and disbanded throughout the area. They lacked supplies, reinforcements, and armaments. But in the eyes of such men as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, they were not yet defeated. These guerrilla bands attacked smaller British outposts in hit-and-run offensives.
Take him! Fire! British, make ready! British, fire!
British Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton countered by carrying out raids with his dragoons and light infantry. These troops succeeded in destroying American supply columns. Tarleton was known to give no quarter, meaning that he would routinely kill American prisoners. In one such raid in May of 1780 at a place called Wax House, Tarleton's men captured 350 Virginia Continentals and savored all but 100. This massacre aroused the bitter resentment throughout the countryside, and skirmishing continued all summer. Meanwhile, in the north, General George Washington pursued his strategy of attack and retreat, keeping British forces on the move and making them defend the cities and townships they controlled. The British were also under attack by the French Navy, but so far had not lost a battle at sea. During the time of the fall of Charlestown and Savannah, Brigadier General Baron de Kalb of France was the new commander of the Continental soldiers, who numbered up to 2,000 men. They had already marched nearly 800 miles, but did not arrive in time to provide the needed reinforcements. De Kalb's men were in danger of starvation. Reinforcements, supplies, and transportation were requested of the governors of Virginia and North Carolina, but none were forthcoming. General Washington was informed of the desperate situation by his Secret Service in New York, and he immediately forwarded this information to the Continental Congress. Without consulting General Washington, Congress had appointed General Horatio Gates to become the commander of the American Army in the South. Gates and his controversial second-in-command, Benedict Arnold, had already decisively defeated a large British army at the Battle of Saratoga. Certainly, Gates must have been impressed with the urgency of the situation. 6 weeks later, he arrived at de Kalb's camp to take command. Because he was an experienced soldier, de Kalb had carefully prepared a plan of action to be submitted to General Gates. Fort Camden, South Carolina, was an important British post under the command of Lord Rawdon. There was information supplied by General Thomas Sumter suggesting that there were only 700 British troops in the area. Surely Gates envisioned another great victory, if only he could persuade enough militia, riflemen, and new recruits to join forces. And Gates ignored de Kalb's plan and instead decided to march on Fort Camden by the shortest route possible. De Kalb had wanted to approach by way of Salisbury and Charlotte through a countryside abundant with much-needed supplies. But to the amazement of several Gates officers, he ordered his troops to be ready at moment's notice. On the 27th of July, he put what he called his Grand Army on its march to Camden. With high ideals and high hopes for the just cause of the American Revolution, they marched through swampy but barren of supply countryside at great sacrifice. The sick and underfed men took 2 weeks to cover 129 miles. Gates had honestly thought there would be rum and rations delivered on the way. But this did not happen. Gates assured his men that they would find peaches and corn growing by the Petey River. Instead, they only found lean cattle, green peaches, and green corn. The soldiers were already sick from eating green peaches. They got even sicker from eating green corn. Some even tried to thicken a stew they had made with hair powder. The men developed many cases of dysentery. They were in a miserable state of discomfort. Despite these setbacks, Gates' army seemed to be growing. Coswell's militia had agreed to temporarily stop hunting Tories and join Gates' army's forces at Mitch's Creek. Gates' militia now increased to a force of about 2,100 men. Lord Cornwallis was informed of the American movement towards Fort Camden. Lord Rawdon was reinforced with about 900 men. Tarleton's Legion was soon to arrive, and Lord Cornwallis was also on the move with reinforcements from Charlestown. He arrived 3 days before the battle. On August 13th, Gates was now 13 miles north of Camden at Rugley's Mills. He planned a surprise attack on Camden. His Grand Army was 7,000 men strong, made up of Maryland and Delaware Continentals, militia of North Carolina and Virginia, artillery, Armand's Legion, and Porterfield's light infantry. He was, however, caught in a quandary as to what to do next. He could not remain idle, as his men were starving and badly in need of rations. If he moved to the left, Camden would be at his rear. A movement to the right would appear as retreat. So, without any clear plan or purpose, he pushed straight forward. In reality, the number of American troops fit for battle was about 3,000, but Gates did not learn of this until the next morning. In fact, many of the militia had been issued their weapons without proper training in the use of the bayonet, or even training on how to load and fire their muskets. Confused, bewildered, and hungry, these men still attempted to follow orders best they could. Opposite the Americans was a British force that should have numbered 4,000 men, but at least 800 were sick and in the hospital. The morning report revealed that Cornwallis only had 2,117 men fit for regular duty. Half of this force was well-seasoned regulars. There were 2 Tory regiments, the Volunteers of Ireland, the British Legion, 2 regiments of Carolina militia, and some Scottish Highlanders. Cornwallis himself believed that the American army numbered as many as 7,000 men, and that he was outnumbered 3-1. He also believed that if he did not attack, the British would be in danger of losing a major stronghold in the South. With the conviction that his troops were better prepared and disciplined, Cornwallis decided to attack. General Gates, too, was determined to attack, but gradually his grand army became more imaginary than real. He was also startled by reports concerning British cavalry in the area. He began to doubt the accuracy of Sumter's report that claimed there were only 700 British soldiers nearby. When he finally summoned his officers for advice, he was met mostly with silence. All who were present still believed there would be plenty of rum, rations, and provisions. At least one officer stated that it was now too late to turn back. And with no dissenting opinion, Gates was reported to have said, "There's enough for our purposes." Unfortunately, that evening, when the rations were finally distributed to feed the troops a full meal before the battle, the food consisted of half-cooked meat and bread. There was no rum. So Gates decided to offer each soldier a gill of molasses and some cornmeal as a substitute. The combination of undercooked food and the sweet delicacy brought on another round of gastrointestinal assaults on the already half-starved troops. Needless to say, men were breaking ranks all through the night and were left very much weakened and debilitated. By a strange coincidence, both Cornwallis and Gates sent their armies toward the enemy at 10 p.m. There were some minor skirmishes in the night at about 2:30 a.m. on August 16th, but both sides retreated to await their confrontation at dawn. Unbeknownst to both sides, the distance between the opposing armies was only about 200 yards. At dawn, Gates apparently did not have any idea what he was in for. Without a clear idea of enemy dispositions, he had resigned himself to let Cornwallis attack first. Gates had assembled his men so that the inexperienced North Carolina and Virginia militia were on the left, opposite the well-seasoned regulars under General Webster. Armand's cavalry was to the rear of the American militia. Maryland and Delaware Continentals were posted on the American right. DeKalb was held in reserve, opposite Rawdon's British Legion and the Irish Volunteers. Tarleton's cavalry was placed in the rear of the British line, formed in columns because of the dense wood. Suddenly, the British regulars were seen marching in column towards the American militia. Cannons began firing from both armies, flooding the field with thick clouds of smoke. As the British regulars rushed forward, the American militia were ordered to advance with the bayonet, huzzahing and firing indiscriminately as they moved forward. And they did so in kind of a panic. The officers were unable to control their men. Since most of the men had not experienced battle before, reacted to the British onslaught by throwing down their muskets and fleeing towards the rear. Some did not even fire one shot. First, the Virginians fled in retreat, followed by the North Carolinians. They fled through Armand's cavalry, who were soon to follow. General Gates, who was only about 600 yards from the front, was also swept away on horseback. General DeKalb, however, quickly formed his Continentals into two ranks and put up stiff resistance to the British regulars. Since DeKalb had no orders from Gates to retreat, he and his Continentals fought gallantly. He attempted to take the offensive, and Rawdon's men created defensive positions. Fierce fighting continued for nearly an hour in and around the woods, when DeKalb was dismounted from his horse. He had already suffered several wounds, including a slash across his forehead, before the 58-year-old Bavarian fell, mortally wounded. Cornwallis, realizing there was no cavalry fight, ordered Tarleton's cavalry to pursue the fleeing militia. Tarleton also attacked the flanks of DeKalb and Coswell's men. Soon, the American line gave way completely. Gates' grand army was now frantically retreating in all directions, away from the battle site. Gates himself galloped on horseback 60 miles to Charlottesville, North Carolina. His army had been soundly defeated. Even though Thomas Sumter had not arrived in time to participate in the battle, he was still in the area, fortifying and securing supplies captured from a British outpost. Tarleton took advantage of this report and surprised Sumter and his men in another bloody attack at a battle called Fishing Creek. Miraculously, Sumter managed to escape with his life, but without shoes or a proper uniform. Back at the Camden battlefield, the Americans had lost all of their artillery, all of their supplies, and nearly all of their muskets and ammunition. Of the Americans, it is believed that they lost somewhere around 700 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Most of these casualties were Continentals. The British lost only 324 men, killed, wounded, or missing. By some accounts, this was the worst defeat of an American army up to the early 1900s. And though Gates received much public criticism, it is generally noted that the soldiers were not so quick to rush to judgment. Nathaniel Greene, who became Gates' replacement in command of the Southern Army, wrote to General Gates, "Given the dispositions, the defeat was much more unfortunate than blamable." General Greene had always been a close confidant of General Washington. Washington and Greene now coordinated their efforts in both the North and South, so that Cornwallis was forced to retreat more and more towards the coast. The French Navy had finally succeeded in defeating the British Navy at sea, thus leaving Cornwallis no choice but to surrender or to be annihilated. The American Revolution was a war fought against all odds. Perseverance and good fortune, combined with the will of a people determined to defend their rights, as laid out in the Declaration of Independence, proved to be the ingredients that would forge the beginnings of a great nation. One based on freedom, democracy, and the inalienable right of the individual to form their own government. Of the people, by the people, and for the people.